Well, this seems to have gotten off to a reasonably positive start. I can't say it's much of a surprise, mind you, since I didn't really commit to doing this project until the first game was finished. Maybe that's cheating. Either way, the first game is done, dusted, and available to download now from itch.io. Link in the description and all that jazz. Historically, I've focused mainly on first-person games for my actual releases and UI-based games for my Twitch interactive types, occasionally with some ceremonial 3D objects thrown into the background to spice things up a bit. And whilst I don't think I'm particularly proficient at anything UI-based in Unity, I thought I'd start off with a UI game by virtue of the fact I know I can make them quickly, and that there's generally less that can go wrong with them. It also seemed like the most logical way to approach the game I wanted to make, a pseudo-hacking game in the style of Introversion Software's underrated 2001 masterpiece Uplink, a game so immersive that when I first played it, I hastily unplugged the modem for fear that I would be arrested for actual computer hacking. This was back in the pre-Wi-Fi days of the early noughties and when demos for games still came on discs included with PC Gamer magazine. 14-year-old me was perhaps a little slow on the uptake, especially considering I'd installed it on my laptop, which wasn't even hooked up to the modem. Anyway, Daedalus is a pseudo-hacking game with the smallest slither of a story to it. Much like with Uplink, there's relatively little preamble in the menu. You're simply plopped onto a computer console with a few command prompts and left to your own devices. Whilst I initially wanted this to be a full-screen, immersive experience, Ash the Bash pointed out to me that if I'm going for the classic retro look of an 80s computer, I should probably stick with a 4:3 resolution ratio. This also made scaling for different computers a total non-issue, since unless you were planning on playing it on a 25-year-old machine, you're going to be playing it in a fixed window. This game trotted along quite nicely without too many issues. I realised quite early on, though, that I'd made something of a pig's breakfast of the mechanics for how strings were going to be delivered to the monitor. For reasons that escape me now, I ended up having a random combination of hard-coded strings written into the code and easily editable public strings that were accessible in the editor. Aside from being just a generally terrible idea and horribly inconsistent, this decision led to a specific problem which cost me far more time than I'd care to admit. Specifically, the issue of when the little arrow that represents the start of a new line is added to the text mesh object. You see, because I'd been inconsistent with the coding, some methods added a new line character and the arrow at the end of the previous string, whereas others added the little arrow at the start of the next string. This led to instances where I'd have double arrows on some lines, no arrows on others, line breaks in some places where I didn't want them, single line breaks where I wanted double line breaks, and all manner of other issues besides. If I'd been a good coder, I'd probably have re-engineered it from the ground up, but as has been well established I am not a good coder, I worked around it with the code I already had. The other thing that I thought would be quite important for a game like this was the aesthetic. Being a UI game, I'd already established that this wasn't going to be anything with earth-shattering graphics, but that didn't mean I couldn't do a nice job with the aesthetics. What's the difference between graphics and aesthetics, you ask? Glad you asked. Graphics is generally defined as the visual fidelity of the game, or to put it another way, the amount of detail that is on display, whereas aesthetics refers to the visual style and overall look of a game. Think about something like Mini Metro for a second. The graphics are very simple and rather primitive, but the aesthetics are gorgeous and really suit the style of gameplay that's on display. With this in mind, I decided to look for a shader that would provide my screen with that 1980s glowy computer look, and found something that just about did the trick. Coupled with a little bit of post-processing trickery, and my game was starting to look pretty nice. The primary gameplay loop of Daedalus actually utilises one of the simplest things one can do in coding, comparing strings. I've mentioned the word string twice now, so this seems like a good jump-off point for a mini lesson. For those not really into computer game design, a string is just a name given to a collection of characters. Alongside Boolean, which is a true or false variable, and an integer, which is a whole number, a string is just about the simplest type of variable that is actually worthwhile using. String comparison, then, is simply the process by which you check whether or not two strings match. In this case, more often than not, a predefined answer string is compared with the input that has been typed by the player. If the strings match, the game does one thing. If they don't, it does something else. I mean, there's slightly more going on than just that, like some branches of the game will have multiple correct inputs leading to different parts, but not a lot really. The whole game is essentially one giant flowchart. If I was looking to spend more time on the game, I'll probably procedurally generate things like the usernames, passwords, IP addresses, emails, and file names in the game, a bit like I have done with the loading screen. However, the rationale behind doing that would be to give the game a little more replayability, and I don't really think it's the sort of game one would want to replay particularly. Even if the ancillary details have changed, the puzzles are effectively the same, and replays would just become a time sink. Consequently, your first playthrough will probably take around 30 to 60 minutes depending on how good your typing is, and your second playthrough is likely to take you under a minute if your memory is good. All that having been said, it's a self-contained, functioning game which should hopefully provide some entertainment. If you wanted a little replay value out of it, there are technically 3 endings, if you include what I would loosely describe as the game over screen. To be fair, that's only an ending in the same way that giving a book to a charity shop after reading chapter 1 constitutes finishing a novel, but still, 3 end states. There's some other poorly camouflaged inspirations and Easter eggs to look out for too. Apart from the uplink come text adventure style of gameplay, there's callbacks to movies like The Matrix and a few references to other games and TV shows that I like lurking about. Let me know in the comments how many you spot. From here then, we move on to game number 2. I'm now at the point where I'm tied into the project without having an idea all ready to go, so I feel like I'm slightly on the back foot. I've got a few things I'd like to try over the course of the next few months, but I need to flesh them out more fully, at least in my head. One thing I'd definitely like to do is try stuff that I've not done before, rather than relying on my safe space of first-person puzzle adventures. With that in mind, I'm thinking game number 2 might take the big boy step out of UI and into full 2D, maybe with some form of platforming game. If I move to do so, I might make an in-progress diary entry along the way, so you can check in with how things are ticking along. But if I don't, I guess I'll see you in a few weeks' time. Until then, happy hacking!